The air at the county equipment auction in the fall of '78 was thick with the smell of diesel, cheap cigars, and something else. Easy money. It was a heady perfume, and most of the men there were drunk on it. They stood in clusters, plaid shirts and seed corn caps, forming a patchwork of optimistic color against the grey November sky. Their voices were loud, confident, full of talk about $5 corn and land prices that had nowhere to go but up. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of an old Ford F-250, just watching. My name is Dale, and I wasn't there to buy. Not a tractor, anyway. Maybe a set of post-hole diggers if they went cheap, or a decent bench vise. My money was in my pocket, not the bank's, and there wasn't enough of it to play in the high-stakes game unfolding before me. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim, was working the crowd into a frenzy over the centerpiece of the sale. A brand-new John Deere 4640 with jewels, cab, air, and a radio. It gleamed under the weak sun, the green paint so deep you felt you could dive into it. It hadn't even been properly broken in, the tires still had the little rubber hairs on them. The owner had farmed for exactly one season before his wife had run off with a feed salesman from Des Moines, and now his whole life was being sold to the highest bidder. I got $28,000, who'll give me 29. 29. Make it $29,000, boys. This tractor's clean as a whistle. You won't find another one like it, Slim chanted, his voice a hypnotic rhythm. Frank Miller's arm shot up. 29, he boomed, a grin splitting his face. Of course it was Frank. He'd been buying up everything that wasn't nailed down for the last 3 years. 2 farms bordering mine, another section over by the river bottom. And with every piece of land, he bought a new piece of equipment to work it. He was the poster boy for the new way of farming. Borrow big, expand fast, and let the good times pay the bills. He stood there in a new Carhartt jacket, not a speck of grease on it, his hands clean. He looked less like a man who worked the soil and more like a man who managed it from a distance. He caught my eye from across the crowd and gave me a little nod, the kind a king gives a peasant. Someone else bid 30. Frank didn't hesitate. 31. The bidding stalled out. Slim tried to work his magic, but everyone knew Frank had the deepest pockets, or at least the friendliest banker. Sold for $31,000 to Mr. Frank Miller, Slim yelled, slamming his gavel. A smattering of applause went through the crowd. Frank puffed out his chest and walked over to his new prize, running a hand over the hood like it was a prized racehorse. A few of his cronies went with him, slapping him on the back. I just shook my head and turned to leave. I'd seen enough. Not buying today, Dale. Frank's voice cut through the noise. He'd walked over, leaving his admirers by the Deere. Just looking, Frank. That's a nice-looking machine. It's the best, he said, not with pride, but with a kind of smug certainty. You get what you pay for. You ought to trade in that old green monster of yours. A man can't make a living with outdated iron. He was talking about my Steiger. My Bearcat, too. It was a 1974 model, one of the early articulated four-wheel drives that came out of Fargo. It wasn't pretty. The original lime green paint was faded to the color of a dull pea, with patches of primer showing through where I'd welded up a crack in the frame. The cab was just a steel box with glass. No air conditioning, no radio, just a simple vinyl seat and a forest of long, unforgiving gear levers. But under the hood was a Caterpillar 3208 V8 diesel, a naturally aspirated engine that made 225 horsepower. It was a simple, tough, mechanical beast. And more importantly, it was mine. I'd bought it used 5 years ago and finished paying it off last spring. Every bolt, every drop of oil, every dent in the fenders belonged to me and nobody else. The old girl still gets the job done, I said, keeping my voice even. Frank laughed, a short, sharp bark. Gets the job done? Dale, this is 1978. The game's changed. It's about efficiency, gallons per acre, field speed. My new Deere there, it's got a sound guard cab. I can listen to the radio, drink a cup of coffee, and cover twice the ground you can in a day, and I won't be half as tired when I'm done. You're trying to win the Indy 500 with a horse and buggy. My buggy's paid for, I said quietly. The smile on Frank's face tightened just a little. That one had hit a nerve. Debt is a tool, Dale. Smart men use it to get ahead. It's the ones who are scared to borrow, the ones who sit on their hands, who get left behind. You mark my words." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt more like a dismissal. He walked back to his new tractor, the king returning to his throne. I walked away from the auction, the sound of the crowd and Slim's fast-talking voice fading behind me. I didn't get a vice or the post-hole diggers. The prices were too high, inflated by the same easy credit that had bought Frank his new John Deere. As I drove my old Ford home, the setting sun glinting off the chrome, I thought about what Frank had said. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool, a relic from a bygone era, clinging to old-fashioned ideas about debt and ownership. All around me, my neighbors were expanding, modernizing, living high on the hog, and I was just holding on. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks watching, have you ever known a man like Frank? The kind who borrows his way to the top, thinking the good times will never end, looking down on anyone who does things the old way. Let me know in the comments below, because what happened next in our county was something nobody saw coming, and it tested every one of us to our breaking point. The following spring, my old Steiger decided to test me. It was the middle of May, the soil was just right, and I had 200 acres of corn ground left to disc. I was halfway through the big field behind the house when I felt it. A slight shudder, a hesitation in the hydraulics when I lifted the big Alice Chalmers offset disc at the end of a pass. The steering suddenly felt heavy, sluggish. I knew that feeling. It was the feeling of a hydraulic pump starting to give up the ghost. I pulled the big tractor to a stop, the Cat V8 rumbling like a caged lion, and climbed out. A thin, clear stream of hydraulic oil was weeping from the main pump body, dripping onto the hot bell housing and sizzling into a wisp of smoke that smelled like burnt money. I shut her down, and the sudden silence of the field was deafening. The pump was shot. Calling the dealer wasn't an option. They'd want $400 for a new pump, plus another $200 for a service call to come out and install it. That was money I didn't have to spare. There was only one way this was going to get fixed. My way. I drove the ailing beast back to the machine shed, the steering fighting me the whole way. It took me the rest of the afternoon. The shop was my sanctuary, a long metal building with a concrete floor stained by 60 years of grease and oil. The air inside always smelled of cold steel, welding fumes, and gear lube. This was where I was most comfortable. The first step was draining the hydraulic system. I found a clean 55-gallon drum and pulled the main drain plug. 30 gallons of high-guard fluid gushed out, warm and slick. While it drained, I started the process of getting to the pump itself. It was buried deep in the tractor's guts, bolted to a gear-driven accessory drive. I had to pull the left side fuel tank just to get a clear look at it. That meant disconnecting the fuel lines, the sending unit wire, and unbolting 4 heavy brackets that were covered in a thick cake of oily dirt. The tank was still a quarter full, and wrestling 50 gallons of diesel in a clumsy steel box off the side of a tractor is a young man's game. I wasn't a young man anymore. By the time I had the tank on the floor, sweat was stinging my eyes and my back was screaming. But there it was. The pump. A heavy cast-iron lump of precision engineering. I spent the next hour carefully disconnecting the high-pressure steel lines, meticulously labeling each one with a piece of masking tape so I'd remember how they went back together. The fittings were frozen tight with rust and time. I had to use a 3-foot cheetah pipe on my biggest wrench, bracing my feet against the massive Firestone tire and pulling until I felt the muscles in my shoulders tremble. One by one, with a groan of protesting metal, they broke free. Finally, I unbolted the pump from its mounting. It weighed a good 70 pounds, and lifting it out of the tight confines of the tractor frame was like trying to birth a cannonball. I finally wrestled it free and carried it over to my workbench, my arms shaking with the strain. I laid it on a clean rag under the bare bulb of my work light. It was late now, and the night chill was seeping into the shed. The next day, I didn't go to the field. I went to the workbench. I disassembled that pump piece by piece, laying out the gears, the seals, the pressure plates on a clean piece of cardboard in the exact order they came out. I found the problem soon enough. A tiny O-ring on the main pressure valve had become brittle with age and heat, and it had split. allowing high-pressure oil to leak past and erode the valve seat. I drove my pickup into town, not to the fancy new dealership on the edge of town, but to a dusty old place called Bearing and Drive Supply. The guy behind the counter, old Gus, had been selling seals and bearings since the Truman administration. He looked at my worn-out parts through his thick glasses. "Well now, Dale," he grumbled, "this here is a standard Parker seal kit. They don't make 'em for this pump anymore, but—" He disappeared into the back, the sound of rattling drawers echoing in the quiet store. He came back a few minutes later with a small dusty box. "This rebuild kit for a Cessna hydraulic motor uses the same seals. Should get you going." The kit cost me $42. I spent the rest of the day meticulously cleaning every part of the pump with kerosene, then carefully reassembling it with the new seals and O-rings, coating each piece with clean hydraulic oil. It was slow, painstaking work. One piece of grit, one nicked seal, and the whole thing would be useless. Just as I was torquing the last bolt on the pump housing, I heard a vehicle pull up. It was Frank Miller in his shiny new Silverado. He didn't get out, just rolled down the power window. "Heard you had a breakdown, Dale," he called out, a smirk playing on his lips. He gestured with his head toward the field behind my house. "I just finished my corn ground. That new 4640 pulls that 24-foot disc like it's not even there. You need me to come over and finish up for you?" For a small fee, of course. The offer was wrapped in a thick blanket of condescension. "I'm all right, Frank, just a little maintenance." "Maintenance?" he laughed. "Looks like major surgery to me. You know, the dealer would have had you up and running in a few hours. Time is money, Dale. You're losing your planting window." "I've got more time than money, Frank," I said, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. He just shook his head, the look on his face a mixture of pity and contempt. "Suit yourself. Don't come crying to me when you're planting corn on the 4th of July. He rolled up his window and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. His words stung because there was a grain of truth to them. I was losing time. At the coffee shop the next morning, I could feel the eyes on me. I heard the whispers. "Dale's big Steiger is down. Trying to save a buck and it's going to cost him his crop." They saw my self-reliance not as a strength, but as a foolish liability in this new, fast-paced world. It took me another full day to get the rebuilt pump back in the tractor, wrestle the fuel tank back on, and reconnect all the lines. I filled the system with the fresh, clean oil, crossed my fingers, and turned the key. The big Cat V8 roared to life, filling the shed with its deep-throated rumble. I cycled the hydraulics, turning the wheel back and forth, raising and lowering the three-point hitch. The movements were smooth, powerful, no leaks, no hesitation. I put the tractor in gear and drove it out of the shed into the bright morning sun. It felt strong, reborn. I was 3 days behind schedule, my body ached, and I was dead tired. But as I drove back to the field, I had a feeling of satisfaction that Frank Miller, with all his checkbook farming, would never understand. I had faced a problem and solved it with my own 2 hands. The cost was $42 and a little bit of my pride. But the machine was still mine, and I owed nothing to anyone. The late 70s were a strange time to be a farmer. On one hand, it felt like a golden age. The Russians were buying American grain by the boatload, driving prices to heights we'd never seen before. Corn was over $3 a bushel, and soybeans were pushing $7. Land that my father had bought for $200 an acre was now selling for $2,000, and the bankers were telling us it would be worth $4,000 in another 5 years. The official government line, pushed by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Get big or get out. And the banks were more than happy to help you get big. Their loan officers were like traveling salesmen, knocking on farmhouse doors, offering operating notes and equipment loans at what seemed like ridiculously low interest rates. 7, 8%. It felt like free money. Frank Miller became the living embodiment of that era in our county. He took the bank's money and ran with it. After buying the 4640 at the auction, he leveraged his rapidly appreciating land to buy another 320 acres. To work it, he traded the John Deere, which was barely a year old, for a brand new, top-of-the-line versatile 875, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractor with a Cummins engine that put out close to 300 horsepower. It made my old Steiger look like a garden tractor. He didn't stop there. He built a new 60 by 120-foot machine shed with fluorescent lights and a heated concrete floor. He put up a new grain leg and a 100,000-bushel drying bin so he could hold his grain and play the market instead of selling at harvest time like the rest of us. His wife, Brenda, started driving a new Lincoln Continental, and they took a vacation to Hawaii that winter. At the coffee shop, Frank would hold court, talking about his expansion plans, his marketing strategies, his tax write-offs. The other farmers would listen, mesmerized. He was a success story, the man who had figured out the new rules of the game. He was the future, and I was the past. The good prices helped me too. I had a couple of good years, sold my corn and beans at the peak. But I did something different with the money. The first thing I did was pay off the last of my operating note at the bank. I walked into the loan officer's office, the same man who was giving Frank millions, and handed him a check for the final $8,000 I owed. He looked at me, puzzled. "Dale, you know you have another year on this note. Your land value has tripled. We could extend your credit line to $100,000. Easy. You could buy that 80 acres next to you that's coming up for sale." "I just want to be clear," I said, pushing the check across his desk. "Paid in full." He stamped my note paid and handed it to me. Walking out of that bank, holding that piece of paper, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Instead of buying new land, I invested in my old farm. I put a new steel roof on the barn. I replaced the worn-out 23.130 tires on my Steiger with a brand new set of Firestone deep treads. That alone cost me nearly $4,000, but it was cash on the barrelhead. I bought a new Lincoln arc welder for the shop and a heavy-duty drill press. Tools, things that helped me be more self-sufficient. The rest of the money, a little over $20,000, I put into a simple savings account. It was earning 5.25% interest. My wife, Mary, thought I was crazy. Even my own father-in-law took me aside one Sunday after church. "Dale," he said, his voice full of genuine concern, "I hear Frank Miller just bought the old Henderson place. He's farming nearly 2,000 acres now. You're one of the best farmers I know, son, but you can't stand still. You'll get run over. That money you've got sitting in the bank is losing value every day with this inflation. You should be putting it into something real. Land." "I like sleeping at night, John," I told him. "I don't want to owe anybody anything." He shook his head sadly. "Pride's a poor substitute for profit, son." He wasn't the only one. The talk around the county was that Dale Jensen had lost his nerve. He was too conservative, too scared to take a risk. While Frank Miller was building an empire, I was patching an old barn roof. While he was driving a new Versatile, I was putting new tires on an old Steiger. I was seen as a failure, a man who was being lapped by progress, a stubborn fool clinging to the past while the future was passing him by. I ignored them and kept working. I maintained my equipment with a vengeance. I did my own engine overhauls on my old Farmall M and my John Deere 720 diesel. I learned how to weld cast iron to repair a crack in an old plow frame. My machine shed didn't have a heated floor, but it had every tool I needed to keep my old iron running. My hands were permanently stained with grease, my fingernails never truly clean. Frank's hands were always soft. One evening in the late summer of '79, I was in the shop, replacing the sickle sections on my John Deere combine's grain head, getting ready for harvest. The little radio on the shelf was humming with farm market news. Then the announcer's voice changed. He started talking about the national economy, about runaway inflation hitting 12, then 13%. He mentioned the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a stern-looking man named Paul Volcker, who had just been appointed by President Carter. The announcer read a quote from Volcker. He said he was going to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. To do that, he was going to raise interest rates. Sharply, a strange chill went through the warm, humid air of the shop. I stopped turning my wrench and listened. The announcer mentioned that the prime lending rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, could go up. He didn't say how much. I put down the wrench and walked to the big open door of the shop. I looked across the fields, across the section line that separated my farm from Frank Miller's. In the distance, I could see the silver gleam of his new grain bins towering over the landscape. I could see the roof of his massive new machine shed, all of it bought with borrowed money, all of it tied to an interest rate that floated, that rose and fell with the whims of men in Washington, D.C. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but the long shadows cast by Frank's new bins felt dark and menacing. They stretched across his land and seemed to creep right up to my property line. And I had a sudden gut-wrenching feeling that a storm was coming. Not a thunderstorm with rain and lightning, but a different kind of storm. An economic storm, and I wondered how many of my high-flying neighbors had built their fine new houses out of sticks. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was a voice on the radio in January of 1980. President Carter, his tone grim, announcing a grain embargo against the Soviet Union for their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The effect was immediate and brutal. The price of corn, which had been flirting with $4, dropped a full $1 overnight. Soybeans plunged. The floor had fallen out of the market. At the coffee shop, the confident chatter of the past few years evaporated, replaced by a low, worried murmur. Men who had been planning their winter vacations to Florida were now hunched over their coffee cups, scribbling figures on napkins, their faces tight with anxiety. Frank Miller was there, but he wasn't holding court anymore. He sat at a table by himself, staring out the window, a muscle twitching in his jaw. His new grain bins were full of $3 corn that he needed $4 for just to break even on his loan payments. That spring, the sky turned against us too. It simply stopped raining. April was dry, May was a dust bowl, the young corn plants sprouted in the parched soil, then turned a sickly yellow-green, their leaves curling up tight like little cigars to protect themselves from the relentless sun. Day after day, the sky was a blank, hazy metallic blue. The heat was oppressive, shimmering in waves off the fields. Ponds dried up, their muddy bottoms cracking into intricate patterns like shattered pottery. My old Steiger pulled the planter through the dry dirt, kicking up clouds of dust so thick I could barely see the marker track from the pass before. The Cat V8 didn't seem to mind the heat, its big radiator fan roaring steadily, but I minded. Every round I made, I was planting seed into a grave, seed paid for with cash from my savings account. For Frank, the drought was a catastrophe. His whole operation was built on the promise of high yields. His banker had approved his massive loans based on projections of 150 bushel corn. In that heat, we'd be lucky to get 70. His big new equipment, designed to cover huge acreages quickly, now sat idle most of the time. There was no point in cultivating when there was no moisture to conserve. One afternoon in early July, I saw his versatile 875 stopped in the middle of the field bordering mine. It was hitched to a massive 32-foot field cultivator. It just sat there for hours, a silent, hulking monument to ambition under the blistering sun. Later that evening, I saw the dealership's service truck pull up beside it, its yellow warning light flashing in the twilight. I didn't see Frank for a few days, but the story made its way around the county. The final drive on the Versatile's left rear axle had gone out. It wasn't a simple bearing or seal. A planetary gear set deep inside the axle housing had self-destructed. It wasn't something a farmer could fix in his own shop. It required specialized hydraulic presses and tools the dealer guarded like state secrets. The parts alone were over $6,000. The service call, with 2 mechanics working for a day and a half in the field, was another $2,000. It was an $8,000 repair bill on a tractor that wasn't even 2 years old. The first real crack in his empire appeared not in his fields, but on his face. I saw him at the parts counter in town a week later. He looked haggard. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He'd lost weight and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was buying a handful of hydraulic fittings and nodded at me, a flicker of the old arrogance still there. "Keeping that old museum piece of yours running, Dale?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Just the usual," I said, "changing the oil." "Must be nice," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Simple things. He paid for his fittings and left without another word. The bank was starting to call. You could see the pressure building behind his eyes, like steam in a boiler with no release valve. He'd bet the farm, and the dice had come up snake eyes. The weather, the markets, and now his own modern machinery were all conspiring to betray him. By the fall of 1981, the word crisis was on everyone's lips. Paul Volcker's war on inflation had become a scorched earth campaign. The prime interest rate, which had been in the single digits when Frank and the others took out their loans, hit a terrifying peak of 21.5%. It was a number so high it seemed like a misprint. Variable rate operating notes, once the key to expansion, became instruments of torture. The math was simple and savage. A $100,000 loan at 8% cost you $8,000 a year in interest. At 20%, it cost you $20,000. Your payment had more than doubled, while the price of your corn had been cut in half. It was like trying to run up a down escalator that was speeding up with every step you took. The county newspaper, once filled with stories of record yields and farm expansions, now had a new section tucked in the back pages. Notices of foreclosure. Every week the list grew longer. First it was the young guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet in the late 70s. Then it was established, multi-generational farms, families who had worked the same ground since the homesteading days. The friendly banker who had once bought you coffee was now a cold-eyed stranger who wouldn't take your calls. The mood in the county turned dark. There was a quiet desperation in the air, a sense of shame and failure that hung over the community like the dust from the year before. Frank Miller was holding on by a thread. He'd sold his wife's Lincoln. He'd sold his new pickup and was driving an old beat-up Chevy Love. He held a private sale to get rid of some of his excess equipment. A gravity wagon, a rotary hoe, things he could live without. But it was like using a teacup to bail out a sinking ship. His debt was too massive, a black hole that consumed every dollar he threw at it. I survived because I was invisible to the storm. I had no debt. The low prices hurt, of course. My income was down by half. But my expenses were manageable, my property taxes, my fuel, my seed. Those were my only real costs. The $20,000 in my savings account, which had once seemed like a pittance, was now a fortress wall. It meant I could buy my seed and fertilizer with cash, avoiding the need for an operating loan entirely. I wasn't getting rich, I was just staying afloat, a small, sturdy boat in a hurricane that was tearing apart the great ships all around me. My old Steiger was the heart of my survival. It was predictable, it was fixable. When an injector line on the Cat V8 started to leak, it cost me $12 and an hour of my time to replace it. I did it myself, in my own shop, with my own tools. I didn't have to make a panicked call to a dealer and wait for a $200 an hour mechanic. My hands were my insurance policy. The end for Frank came in the spring of '82. The bank finally called his entire note due. He didn't have the money. He couldn't borrow it from anyone else. The foreclosure notice appeared in the paper, a cold block of black type listing every parcel of land, every piece of equipment. It was all going to be sold at public auction on the first Saturday in June. The day of the auction was grey and overcast, the sky the colour of lead. It felt appropriate. The crowd was huge, but it was a quiet, somber gathering. No one was laughing or telling jokes. They were there to witness a death. I saw farmers I'd known my whole life standing with their arms crossed, their faces grim. They weren't there to bid. They were there out of a morbid sense of solidarity, thinking that it could just as easily be their farm on the auction block next month. Frank was there, standing beside his wife, Brenda, near the porch of the farmhouse they were about to lose. He looked like a ghost. The flesh seemed to hang off his bones, his new Carhartt jacket from that auction 4 years ago now ridiculously large on his shrunken frame. His eyes were hollowed out, staring at nothing. Brenda was weeping silently into a handkerchief. The auctioneer, the same fast-talking Slim from before, seemed subdued. He knew this wasn't a celebration. It was a wake. He sold the household goods first, then moved to the equipment, lined up in neat, tragic rows. The big, versatile 875 was the main attraction. It was still a magnificent machine, but it was tainted by failure. The bidding was sluggish. No local farmer could afford it, or the risk that came with it. It finally sold for $40,000, less than half of what Frank had paid for it, to a corporate farm from out of state. I watched it all, feeling a profound sadness. There was no victory, no sense of, "I told you so." There was only loss. Frank's dream, the dream of a whole generation of farmers, was being dismantled piece by piece and sold for pennies on the dollar. I was watching my community bleed out. I stayed until the very end. The last items to be sold were from his machine shop, the big air compressor, the drill press, the welder, and his toolbox. A huge red Kennedy rollaway chest filled with snap-on wrenches and sockets. I knew that toolbox. I'd seen him proudly show it off once. It was the one thing he'd owned before he got big, the tools he'd used when he was just a young man starting out. When Slim started the bidding on the toolbox, I raised my hand. A few other people bid, but their hearts weren't in it. I bought the entire setup for $300. After the auctioneer finished, I had one of my neighbors help me load it onto my truck. The crowd dispersed quickly, leaving the farmstead eerily quiet. Frank was still standing there, a statue of a man, as the buyers came to claim their purchases. I drove my truck over and parked it near him. I got out and walked over. He didn't look at me, he just kept staring at the spot where his Versatile had been parked. "Frank," I said softly. He flinched, as if my voice had physically struck him. He slowly turned his head, and for the first time I saw the full depth of his despair. The man was utterly broken. "What do you want, Dale?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Come to gloat? Come to tell me you were right all along?" "No," I said. I gestured back to my truck. "I bought your toolbox. I figured a man should never be without his tools. They're yours. You can come get them whenever you want." He stared at me, his eyes filling with a confusion that slowly gave way to a flicker of understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "And Frank," I added, my voice low, "it's almost planting season. My boy is in college, and Mary's back isn't what it used to be. I could use an extra hand, a good hand. I'll pay you a fair wage." He looked at me then, really looked at me. He saw no pity in my eyes, no charity, just a simple, honest offer from one farmer to another. He swallowed hard, his throat working. He gave a short, sharp nod, unable to trust his voice. I nodded back. "See you Monday morning," I said, and walked back to my truck. Frank Miller came to work for me that Monday. He showed up at sunrise, wearing old work clothes, his face still etched with exhaustion. He didn't say much, he just worked. He knew machinery, and he was a hard worker when he put his mind to it. We worked side by side through that planting season, pulling long hours, speaking mostly about the work at hand, the depth of the planter, the calibration of the seed drill. The unspoken things hung in the air between us, but we let them be. Slowly, over that summer, I saw the life come back into him. The simple act of physical labor, of fixing something with his own hands, seemed to heal him in a way that managing a vast, debt-ridden empire never could. He was brilliant with engines. He tuned the carburetor on my old Farmall M until it purred like a kitten. He figured out a complex timing issue on my John Deere 720 that had stumped me for years. He was at home in my shop, surrounded by the tools he'd thought he'd lost. The community watched, of course. At first, there were whispers. They couldn't understand why I would hire the man who had so openly looked down on me. But as the crisis deepened and more farms went under, they began to see it differently. They saw it not as a rivalry, but as a community trying to hold itself together. Men started stopping by my shop again, not to gossip, but to ask for help. "Dale, my old Oliver won't start. Can you take a look?" "Dale, do you know how to weld this cast-iron hitch?" My farm, once seen as a relic of the past, had become a haven of survival. My old-fashioned self-sufficiency was now recognized as wisdom. Frank worked for me for 2 years. We never spoke of the auction, or the years before it. But one day he came to me and said he and Brenda were moving to Minnesota. Her brother had offered him a job managing a large cooperative. It was a good opportunity, a chance to start over. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Dale," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, his eyes were clear. The ghost was gone. "You'd have done the same for me," I said, though we both knew that probably wasn't true of the man he used to be, but it was true of the man he had become. Life settled back into a rhythm. The farm crisis eventually eased. The prices came back up, but the lessons had been seared into the soul of the heartland. The wild, debt-fueled optimism of the 70s was gone forever, replaced by a hard-won caution. My son, Tom, came back to the farm after he finished his degree in agronomy. I tried to teach him everything I knew, not just about farming, but about life. One afternoon we were in the shop, working on the old Steiger. We were giving the Cat V8 an in-frame overhaul, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings. Tom was carefully torquing the head bolts, his young face a mask of concentration. He paused and looked up at me, his hands stained with grease. "Dad," he said, "some of the guys I went to school with, they're talking about buying the new tractors. The ones with GPS and all the computers. They say we're falling behind with this old iron." I smiled and wiped my own hands on a rag. I walked him to the big shop door, and we looked out at the fields, green and healthy under the afternoon sun. The barn stood sturdy with its steel roof. The grain bins were full, and they were ours. "Tom," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder, "look out there. Nothing you see belongs to a bank. It's ours. Your grandfather worked this land, I've worked it, and someday you'll work it. This tractor," I said, patting its faded green fender, "is more than just a machine. It's a symbol of that. It represents freedom. The freedom from waking up in the middle of the night wondering how you're going to make a payment. There's nothing wrong with new things, son. But never ever borrow your way to prosperity. You build it, slow and steady. You own it, because in the end, it's not about how big you get. It's about how long you last." He looked at the old tractor, then back at the fields, and I saw in his eyes that he understood. He understood the legacy not of acreage or bushels, but of resilience, of independence. I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, but I still spend most of my days in the shop. Tom runs the farm, and he's a better farmer than I ever was. He even bought a slightly newer tractor a few years back, a John Deere 8650 from the late 80s. It's got more horsepower and a quieter cab, but it's simple, mechanical, and he paid cash for it. And sometimes, on a clear spring morning, when he's working the field behind the house, he'll bring out the old Steiger. He says he does it just to keep the engine from seizing up, but I know better. He does it for me. I'll sit on the porch and listen to the distinct, deep-throated rumble of that Caterpillar V8 diesel echoing across the land. It's a sound that has been the bedrock of my life. It's the sound of a debt paid, of a storm weathered. It's the sound of survival.